Finland, the land of thousand lakes and home of many famous lure makers and companies that have innovated and shaped the fishing industry on a global scale. Today I want to pay a tribute to one of those early legendary innovators whose handiwork is largely unknown outside of Finland. Let me introduce to you to the Hermit of Päijänne, the Emperor of Korea. Not the country, but a windspread island in the middle of Lake Päijänne. This is the tale of Toivo Pylväläinen and my humble attempt of recreating one of his earlier works. So, you might find yourself asking, why is this guy important? Well, if you ever heard of this little company called Rapala, or Rapala as we Finns call it, currently the biggest lure manufacturer in the world, it was Toivo who shared his secrets to Lauri in the very beginning on how to make fishing lures that moved like wounded fish whenever the two would meet on Toivo's island in the middle of Lake Päijänne, where both of them were fishing and often bumped into each other. Before we start, I thought it would be pretty interesting to have a look at some of Toivo's work and maybe make some parallels to the Rapala original. I mean, the design language is definitely quite similar, albeit Toivo's work is a lot more cruder than the more refined Rapala original lure. So today I'm going to be making my own version of the OG Pylväläinen and paying homage to the originator and innovator in the Finnish pantheon of lure makers. And I'm going to be using a very uncommon material that you don't see being used that often nowadays: cork. So back in the day, before manufacturers and tinkerers figured out it would be better to use pine bark or balsa wood to make their wallpers, or pappu as we Finns call these type of lures, which have a lip that generates a whopping action to the lure, were mostly made out of cork, which they would get from Swedish life preservers, of all things. Unfortunately, I could not find any 100-year-old Swedish life preservers here in Canada, so I'm going to be using cork coasters that you could buy from places like Dollarama, where nothing actually costs $1 anymore. A very distinct thing about Toivo's lures, if you noticed, is that the swimming lip is right next to the first belly hook hanger, which is kind of unique, I think. I don't think I've seen any other maker make lures like this before, or with that configuration. So I'm actually really curious to see how this lure will swim in the end. A lot of those earlier looking wobblers are kind of like an elongated teardrop in their shape, so that's kind of what I'm trying to go for here with this little sketch. So most of the models that I could find from the internet that Toivo made were between 10 and 12 centimeters, so I decided to go with kind of like happy medium of 11 centimeters, which is 4.3 inches for you imperial users. Toivo was born in 1894 to Vilppu and Olivia. His mother Olivia died when he was 8 years old. Times were tough during those years, and despite of them having their own plot of land and a farm, Toivo ended up working with a neighbor as a stable boy. However, his restless spirit didn't allow him to stay put for a long time, resulting him to take to the road and travel around eastern Finland for a decade doing odd jobs. When Toivo turned 23, he decided to volunteer and joined the armed forces, where his previous experience working with farm animals such as horses landed him an opportunity to get a further education besides elementary school as a horse attendee in St. Petersburg, which back then was still part of Finland. The course lasted whole 3 weeks, giving him the only education he ever got. During 1918, he partook in the bloody Finnish Civil War between the White Finns and the Red Socialist Workers' Party in Vuoksi River frontline. So I'm not sure what sort of glue or what sort of bonding agent they use to make these coasters, but it is very brittle. So I just decided to use a knife to cut around the outlines, and that worked out pretty well. Alright, let's get back to our lure for a little bit. So I decided that, you know what, I'm not gonna use any kind of power tools to make this lure because that would kind of defeat the purpose of trying to make this authentic. So instead I'm going to be using just hand tools for the whole project. And here I'm making this kind of like a sanding block to help me make sure that everything is gonna be perfectly 90-degree angles when I actually do the sanding, which I'm not really sure if that's really that necessary, but I decided to do it anyway. Oh, by the way, just so you guys know, I do have a Patreon account too, where I post behind the scenes footage and upload all the future videos before you see them on YouTube. So if you're interested in supporting the channel, that's a great way to do so. And of course, liking and commenting really helps with the YouTube algorithm as well. So let's get back to the history lesson. So after completing his military service in 1920, he headed to his sister and her husband's farm and worked as a horse attendee. But after a few months he felt the call of the road once again and left. And after roaming around a little bit, he found himself working as a railroad worker and quickly rose up through the ranks, where his hard work and leading skills acquired in the military landed him the title of a railroad foreman. During this time he befriended a lady working in the railroad canteen, and the two quickly became an item in secret. During this time the canteen lady became pregnant and Toivo was suspected to be the father. He, on the other hand, decided he didn't want to have anything to do with the situation and took to the road once again, leaving the people he knew thinking that he had drowned in the nearby river, where in actuality he made up his way upstream the river Kymi and found himself in Lake Päijänne, a vast system of islands and rich trout fishing grounds. During this time, up until 1930, he lived basically as a vagabond, working as a logger whenever he felt like it and as a fisherman in the lake system, never having a permanent place to stay, hopping from island to island, which most of the time would have some sort of permanent occupancy on them. While spending time on the lake, he started tinkering around and started developing his own lures, which most of the time were various types of wobblers that he would troll around the Lake Päijänne. Because this material is so brittle, I decided to clamp it in between two pieces of wood to make sure that it will stay intact when I do the sawing for the internal wire harness slot. When I was using the hacksaw to cut the internal wire harness slot and the lure was still in the vise, I kind of had a hard time seeing where the cut would end, so I decided to take it out from the vise, and now I'm just basically pulling it against the teeth on the table, and this is definitely a lot easier to see where the cut is supposed to end. Alright, let's get back to our story. So, during his fishing trips around the lake system, Toivo came across a log cabin in a small island called Koreakoivu, loosely translated as a beautiful birch tree because of a particularly handsome looking birch tree that was sitting on the island. And since no one was living in it, he took up residency, making this rocky island his permanent home for years to come. After settling down to the island, Toivo would mostly make his living from selling lake trout his lures caught during his many excursions to the lake. He would then sell his catches in the local market, where he would often chat up the locals and recant his epic fishing tales around the lake, earning him the nickname Emperor of Korea. Again, not the country, but the island. Alright, so now that we have the internal wire harness slot, we definitely needed something to go inside of that, which will be the internal wire harness. And here I'm using 1mm thick spring steel for the wire, and we're just going to start bending it into a nice shape. By the way, since we're in the process of bending the internal wire harness, I thought it might be an interesting tidbit to throw out there for you guys, that it was actually Toivo Pylväläinen who patented the internal wire harness. And yeah, you could probably say that he was the godfather of the internal wire harness, or at least he had the patent for it. Bending the wire harness by hand takes a lot of patience and being able to think forward on your next move. Even the minute change affects how the end result will turn out. So I oftentimes insert the wire inside the lure, checking that everything is proportionate and up to my standard. You might have noticed that I bended the wire into the hook hanger loops when I was forming the wire harness. Well, now I just need to snip them slightly with the help of some wire cutters so that they will stay inside the lure when I glue them in with 5-minute epoxy. During the early 1930s, while living on the island, Toivo would often have visitors who had heard of this enigmatic hermit who lived all by himself and made lures that were said to have had almost magical fish catching abilities. But I have a feeling that that probably had something to do with the fact that this guy was very good at telling tall tales, and they were just spread around the area where he lived. You see, even though Toivo was considered as an hermit and a bit of an outcast by his own will, he actually liked people and enjoyed having people over to visit him on the island. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, one of those visitors was none other than Lauri Rapala, and later his sons would also take part in the visits to the Hermit's Island, where they would test out their lures. The early versions of Toivo's lures were made out of cork, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, but he did experiment with pine bark too. To what extent, I'm not really sure, as the literature in the subject is pretty limited. However, I did learn that his idea of a good lure was it should not be too big and too small, something around the size of an index finger, and it should not be too pretty to pass as an injured little fish. To my delight, the 5-minute epoxy actually helped a lot in making the lure a lot more rigid from what it was before. Even though I can't really say that it was solid yet, but I think we can remedy that with a couple of coats of epoxy when I seal the lure. But before that, I'm going to shape the lure, and I'm starting that off with using the sanding tool you saw me make earlier, as there was not much of material to get rid of anyways. The final shaping of the lure I did with 100 grit sandpaper, and it took me no time at all to get the shape where I was happy how it looked. And I'm sure there's a lot of you out there who might be wondering why I didn't add any ballast weight into the lure. Well, it's because the lure is so thin, it will ride itself up in the water after I add the hooks and the hook hangers. And this is a very common way of making these type of trolling lures in Finland. After all that speed sanding, it's time to give the lure its first coat of true coat epoxy. If you ever think of using this material yourself, it might be a good idea to use something else to seal the lure, as the true coat epoxy tends to be on the softer side. Because of that, I ended up adding 3 coats of the epoxy to give the lure some additional rigidity. Okay, so even though this lure is meant to be kind of an homage or even kind of a copy of the original Pylväläinen, I felt like I wanted to add something of my own into it too. So I figured that one other really old method of adding pizzazz to a lure could be the use of foil. And what better way to utilize this material than to make the pattern myself. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. So I'm cutting some normal household foil here. I think the best kind for this would be to use that barbecue one that tends to be a little bit thicker than the stuff that I'm actually using here. For the pattern, we are going to be needing a metal file, eraser, and a lot of perseverance. You could probably use a rolling pin for this too, but I actually found the eraser to be surprisingly effective in imprinting the pattern from the file into the foil. By the way, I'm not sure, but this might be the first time I'm seeing this specific method being displayed on YouTube. I've personally known it for years now and used it a lot when I was first starting out some decades ago. Anyways, I'm sure that there's a lot of other ways to go about this and make really cool patterns. So if you know any of them, please do drop them in the comment section and share your wisdom. Now that I have the pattern imprinted on the foil, I'm going to be using the lure to trace out the outlines with a pen, while being mindful not to press too hard and possibly causing the foil imperfections from the lure and the paper towel that I had placed in the bottom. Once I had the two halves done, it's just a matter of cutting them out with some scissors. Since I'm going to be gluing the foil into the lure, I need to make sure that the surfaces are not shiny and it will accept the glue nicely and have a good grip on it. So it's once again time for some speed sanding. Last time I used some foil, I used normal wood glue, and I did the same here, except it didn't really work well and the foil got really wrinkly and just ugly looking. So I just ripped it off and re-sanded the surfaces, and instead of wood glue I used 5-minute epoxy, and that worked out a lot better. I started applying the epoxy to the less shiny side of the foil with a bamboo stick, but quickly noticed that it was kind of inefficient and I just used my finger to smear the epoxy evenly. After all, I was wearing some gloves. Once the whole surface was covered with epoxy, I carefully placed the lure on top of the foil and lifted it up from the desk and started carefully, almost massaging the foil. Always making sure that I was going towards the edges instead inward. Here you can see that massaging action that I was talking about a little bit closer. What I know from past experience is that you really want to handle the foil delicately and not force it into shape. Forcing it to conform to the shape of your lure will result in wrinkles every single time. So, if you want to try foiling a lure, I found that the best results come from using lure shapes that are pretty flat, like the lure that I'm making in this video. After the foiling, I gave the lure 3 layers of epoxy and sanded the surfaces, and added 2 more layers before moving to painting. And of course, I forgot to film that. Oh well, you're not losing much there. Anyways, a lot of Tova's lures were pretty crude looking, as he didn't have an airbrush and pretty much painted everything by hand, possibly with a paintbrush. I was thinking I should do the same, but decided not to, and instead focus on keeping the color palette simple with only 3 colors. A white belly, black back, and hangover red eyes. And you know, in all honesty, this is all you need to paint a really effective lure that just flat out catches fish. It's said that Tova made his last lure somewhere in the 50s, and today these small little talismanic tokens of fishing history fetch thousands of euros whenever they show up in auctions, which is not very often. I personally would love to own one, but chances of me ever getting one are slim to none, as they are pretty rare to come by. So that's why I'm basically making my own. For the final coat, I'm brushing on some True Coat epoxy, like always, and let my trusty old lure turner do its thing and even out the epoxy layers. And in the end, I ended up settling to 2 layers of epoxy for the final coat. One more crucial thing I need to add to the lure to make it functional, and that is to make and add a lip to it. Tova used various shapes in his lures, but I kind of prefer the round type that you saw in the beginning of the video, so I'm going with that one. To help me get the perfect round shape, I'm going to be using this 5-cent coin to trace out the shape on this 1mm thick Lexans sheet. If this was any other video, I would probably be heading to the garage right about now and cutting the lip with the bandsaw, but since I have this self-imposed rule about not using any power tools, I'm going to be cutting the lip out with tin snips and then just sanding the edges with sandpaper. Okay, let's saw the lip groove. If you look closely, you'll see that I've put a little nick on the epoxy where I want the lip to begin and to help me guide the hacksaw blade in the beginning. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has started sawing and then accidentally skid along the surface. The hacksaw blade was not quite thick enough to accommodate the lip that I tend to use for this, so the slot needs to be made slightly bigger. And I did that just by folding some sandpaper and sanding it. I didn't want to extend the lip slot further, so I decided to notch out the lip itself so that it kind of has wings on both sides that will then hug against the lure body. This is a pretty common thing that you see in Finnish trolling crankbaits, especially the ones that have a saddle lip on them. Okay, so now that the lip is done, naturally I will just mix up some 5-minute epoxy and glue it into place. Alright, let's have a little bit of a closer look on the end result on the lure. And I have to say I'm fairly happy with how it turned out. And I know I say that pretty much every single time I make a video, but yeah, I'm pretty happy how it turned out. And I'm actually kind of excited to show you guys how it swims as well. So it's time for the traditional swim test. And I have to say, I have no doubt in my mind that this would not catch some nice lake trout in Lake Päijänne or anywhere else. But anyways, I hope you guys really enjoyed the video and learned something new. I know I'm not the most consistent uploader on the platform, but I do at least try to put out quality content whenever I have time to make a new video. So with that, I'll see you guys on the next video.